Flaherty Manufacturing Company produces one product, Kibo. Because of wide fluctuations in demand for Kibo, the assembly department experiences significant variations in monthly production levels. The annual master manufacturing overhead budget is based on 300,000 direct labor hours. In July, 27,500 labor hours were worked. The master manufacturing overhead budget for the year and the actual overhead cost incurred in July appear in the table that you see on your screen now. So you see that the master budget on an annual basis had variable cost and fixed cost that came to $1,050,000, and the actual in July were $90,000. Okay, let's take a look at parts A and B. They've asked us to prepare a monthly overhead flexible budget for the year ending December 31st, 2010, assuming monthly production levels range from 22,500 to 30,000 direct labor hours, and we're to use increments of 2,500 direct labor hours. Then on B, we'll prepare a budget report for the month of July 2010, comparing actual results with the budget data based on the flexible budget. Now on this slide, I've duplicated the key numbers that came from the table on the earlier slide, and we're going to have that in front of us so that we can illustrate how we put together Part A, which is the Flexible Monthly Manufacturing Overhead Budget Assembly Department for the year 2010. And it's a flexible overhead budget because we have 4 possible levels of activity, and the levels of activity are based on direct labor hours. Okay, so take a look at indirect labor. We've got it calculated as $1.20, and that represents the cost per direct labor hour. And we calculated that by taking the total indirect labor cost and dividing it by the number of hours that were provided in the problem. When we do this, we derive $1.20 per direct labor hour. Then we multiply it times the 4 different levels of activity. So we're multiplying it times 22,500 direct labor hours. We're multiplying it again times 25,000 direct labor hours. And that one got us 30,000, and so on. Then we go through this same procedure for indirect materials, utilities, and maintenance. All of these were variable cost. We had the total dollar amount. We knew how many direct labor hours were used, and we're able to derive the cost per direct labor hour. So then after we multiply the cost per direct labor hour times the various levels of activity, which again is direct labor hours starting at 22,500, then going up to 30,000 in increments of 2,500 hours. When we put that all together, we can then add to come up with the total variable cost, or we can add the per unit costs and multiply that. The total of the per unit cost comes to 240. Multiply that times the direct labor hours, and we've calculated the total variable cost. Now looking back at the top, you see that fixed costs are given as well, and they're given in a monthly amount and the annual amount. If we take the monthly amount and multiply it times 12, we'll get the annual amount. So we see that at least for July, fixed costs were truly fixed. They did not vary at all. Well, once we know that, we know that those are the costs that will not change regardless of the level of activity. So supervision at 12,500, depreciation at 10,000, and insurance and taxes at 5,000 will remain the same in all 4 columns, regardless of how many direct labor hours take place. And then we add those 3 numbers to come up with total fixed cost of 27,500 per month for all 4 of those levels of activity. We add that to our variable cost, and we've derived the total costs, which is the answer to Part A, to put together a schedule of flexible monthly manufacturing overhead budget for the assembly department for the year 2010 based on 4 different possible levels of activity. Okay, next we look at how we solve Part B. And Part B really involves taking the information at 27,500 of direct labor hours and comparing the flexible budget we just produced at that level to the actual costs that were provided earlier. And I've got a couple arrows here just to show you where the numbers come from. So the 33,000 of indirect labor is written down, and the 19,250 of indirect materials, then the 8,000 of 250 is brought to the budget at 27,500 direct labor hours, and the other numbers go as well. I just chose not to show all those lines. And you see that the total of 93,500, the budgeted amount that we put together on Part A for direct labor hours of 27,500, gets carried forward and becomes the total cost level on our schedule on Part B of Manufacturing Overhead Flexible Budget Report, where we're comparing the budget to the actual July results. And once we compare the budget to the actual results, we then can compute the difference and determine whether the costs were less than budget, in which case we've got a favorable difference, or whether the costs exceeded the budget, in which case it's an unfavorable variance. Okay, next we answer Part C, which says, were costs effectively controlled? And what we see is that based on the budget report that you see, control over cost was effective. We had favorable differences for variable costs, and of course fixed costs, there was no differences between budgeted and actual cost. Part D says, state the formula for computing total monthly budgeted cost in the assembly department. And the formula that we see is that fixed cost of 27,500 plus total variable cost of 240 per direct labor hour unit will generate our total costs for whatever level of activity we incur. And then finally, we take a look at Part E, which says, prepare the flexible budget graph showing total budgeted cost at 25,000 and 27,500 direct labor hours. Use increments of 5,000 on the horizontal axis and increments of 10,000 on the vertical axis. And now I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, now you see the graph in front of you, and you see the fixed cost appear as a horizontal line, about 27,500, and then we've got a variable cost that starts at the fixed cost point where it crosses the y-axis and then goes up on a positive slope because it represents an increase in cost as the direct labor hours go up, and as a result we can see the total budgeted cost line on our graph. We can also then see lines where total cost appeared based on budgeted levels and based on actual results.